and they really saw it as a model. We were still, I think, in that myth. Also encouraged by the West. People were very enthusiastic about what could be done in China, not only for economic and financial benefits, but also as a way for them to show that China could be turned from an authoritarian regime, a dictatorship, not to a democracy, but at least maybe to a less authoritarian, more open regime. And we've seen how that has evolved since then.
The next time around, because
with that, let's now dive into the mailbag.
We've received a cluster of questions, actually, about the adequacy of India's balancing strategy vis-à-vis China. One listener says the challenge from China has only grown and asks if India's China policy has been less characterized by pragmatism than by appeasement, showing, and I quote, extraordinary sensitivity towards Beijing. There are also several questions asking, what are India's options?
I think there are two parts of this question. One is India's past approach, of which there is often discussion, and the second is on India's options ahead. I think if you look at that first question about was it pragmatism or appeasement, I think if you look back, you see that almost every Indian government has seen China as a challenge. And I would say this goes back to almost 1949 at least. But what the different governments, including sometimes within the course of a government, there's been differences over their assessments, over the nature, extent, and urgency of the challenge that China poses, and differences on what best approach to take. And so you have had questions over time about whether or not those assessments were right. You see questions about Prime Minister Nehru and should he have got more in return from China, even a border settlement for the 1954 agreement with China on Tibet, and recognizing Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. So one question is, should he have got more from that? Or the question is, was he naive? Or more recently, you have questions on whether Prime Minister Manmohan Singh should have not seemingly slow-rolled certain balancing activities with partners such as the United States to reassure China. Or whether Prime Minister Narendra Modi should not have given Xi Jinping the benefit of the doubt, both in the 2014-2015 period or in 2018-2019. So you hear these questions, but I think in each case, those judgments that the Prime Ministers made, and you can say that they were inaccurate, but in their own way, it wasn't about appeasement. It was an assessment of, or the calculation of their constraints, of India's constraints, their sense of India's other priorities, and their theories of deterrence. So in many cases, each of these leaders that I mentioned, but others as well, thought that by indeed engaging with China economically, say, or settling, stabilizing the Tibet issue, that they thought part of what they were doing was deterring China through diplomacy and through having a good relationship with this partner and neighbor that India had to grapple with, so they could focus on Indian growth and development. So that was a judgment call. Now you can say that they were wrong, but then you have to think through their calculations about trade-offs and think about whether or not other trade-offs were possible. And I think you've seen the debate about these trade-offs essentially in some ways be the same since India became independent, which is guns versus butter. Do you want to spend money on development versus defense? So somebody like me would say, look, I think that calculation was wrong in the beginning. Deterrence also needs not just diplomacy, but strong defense. But there were trade-offs. If you spent that money on defense, it would take away from development funding. Or you see another trade-off was the China challenge or the Pakistan challenge. Now we see them as linked, but essentially, especially when you were resource constrained or capability constrained, you had to figure out which was your priority challenge and deal with that. And I think at many times, Indian policymakers have prioritized the Pakistan challenge over the China challenge. And then I think a third trade-off that leaders have often themselves had to deal with and struggle with in some ways is the autonomy versus alignment. And I don't say alliance, but autonomy versus alignment. Tara, you are French and work on France, and so you know about strategic autonomy, but this idea that you don't want to ally. And so when people said, oh, India should have looked at this differently in the 40s and 50s or even in the 2000s, the question was, would India then have been willing to do the kind of things with partners that would have been perhaps asked for in return, including a much closer security relationship? And many of the people who say that India shouldn't do those things are also the people who criticize kind of China policy. But again, this comes down to trade-offs. And like I said, you can argue that various policymakers have made inaccurate assumptions about the timeline, when China would be a challenge. They might have had some mirror imaging, assuming that China would set aside geopolitical differences to focus on economic development, just like India was. Or you could say that they made wrong assumptions about the effectiveness of personal diplomacy. And I think it is reasonable to debate these questions about the choices that Indian policymakers have made. But ideally, you should debate them not to pass judgment on these leaders, because I have learned to be humble about thinking through constraints that policymakers face, but thinking through and debating these issues to see what lessons can be learned. How do you make sure that you get these things right the next time around? Briefly, in terms of the way forward, I actually think the contours of India's options are already in place. I think the question is, should India be doing it at a different pace and to a different degree? But I think what you've seen is largely thinking about a broad deterrence approach through diplomacy, through agreements, and through developing strength and partnerships. And so I think it comes down to, one, building India's own capabilities across the board. Second, a network of external partners that both helps build those capabilities, but also shapes a favorable balance of power in the region. And then I think the question perhaps on which there's the most debate in India, and it's going on right now, is how much do you dialogue with China? Do you dialogue with China, and for what? To stabilize the border, for crisis prevention, or for something more, for some sort of normalization? That's usually the third leg. And so I think that will be the most debated. But otherwise, in terms of building capabilities and developing partnerships, I think you've seen India do that. One could question, is it fast enough? Does it go far enough? But nonetheless, I think the contours are in place.
So strategic autonomy, in a word, in two words.
Autonomy, but also accompanied by alignment. I don't think autonomy and alignment are mutually exclusive. I actually think over time, alignment on shared interests could actually help India build that autonomy over time, as France has done over the course of its history. One of the questions that's related to this capabilities balancing question, this broad issue of how China sees India or what might deter it. Related to that, we've got a question from a listener, Omkar, who asks, what would it take for China to consider India as equal in stature?
2 days later, red lines.
I think the building of alliances, partnerships, special relationships, let's say,
it was unwise those days to even think of it.
I don't know if China can overcome really the underlying sense that India will always be weaker. I really think that's something that is built in the Chinese political system. The 1962 military defeat is also very present in their mind. They've seen India attempt to build more capabilities and develop new relationships. But there is a sense for China, and I would say particularly since Xi Jinping, that it is meant to be on its own. It's making the world more dependent on China while making China less dependent on the world. And I think fundamentally it believes that you need to be on your own to be able to defend yourself. And I don't think it sees India as being capable of it. It's looking at developments that India is doing and the special place that India is taking in the world right now very acutely. It doesn't escape the Chinese eye that India wants to take more place, whether it's with the global south or with the global north, actually. I think that's very clear in China's mind, and you see all these op-eds in the global times, in People's Daily. Every time there's some kind of a positive coverage of what India is doing, it's immediately turned down in the Chinese official press. And I think there's a sense to that, because any idea that people could have that China and India could be on par is really something that Beijing wants to downplay as much as possible.
thus far, it is...
The reality of the matter is today the world is still very much dependent on China's value chains and supply chains. Many companies in the US and Europe are thinking about how they could switch part of their dependency on China to India, because India is more democratic, it's a special partner, it makes sense to invest in it in the years to come. Most of the economic growth is going to come from that region. The population is young, it's well educated now, so you see a lot of positive perspective coming out of India. But it's not so easy to change 25 years of investment. The landscape of infrastructure between China and India is vastly different. India has gone in a way already to the fourth industrial revolution, not really doing the second and the third, at least not pushing it as much as possible. And there's a lot that you can do in the digital world. But for growth to happen, you need factories, you need people, you need to train the people who will be working in the factories, and you need to procure the critical raw materials, the critical materials to get these factories working. For this, you need hard infrastructure. India doesn't have to replicate everything that China did. We're in a different world now, so India will have to find its way to do it. I'm not sure that we can just say, let's just give up on China and switch to India. Materially, practically, I don't think that's possible. And also, there are still a lot of companies who don't want to give up on China. So we see a bit of a discrepancy here between official governmental policies and declarations and the reality on the ground from the company side, who are saying, well, for the time being, it would cost us much more to leave China and to go to India, where it would be another level of investment. And we're not saying we won't make this decision, but we'll make it basically when we will have no other choice. And so I think people in China are also following these developments, and they see this discrepancy between the policy world and the economic world, and they're counting on it a little bit, because inside China you see also a very complicated economic situation. Major financial real estate companies are just crashing completely. There are many questions about what to do with the overproduction that China used to export very easily, and what we're seeing now with not decoupling anymore, but the de-risking strategies that are adopted by a number of governments, they're going to play against China's hand. So China is looking at all of this. I think it's conscious of these headwinds that are moving towards India, but I really don't see it as perceiving India to be equal to it for the time being. That might change, but I think there is something there that won't change for the time.
I remember Professor Susan Shirk many years ago wrote about the asymmetry in how India and China see each other, where for China it's distance, it didn't really figure as much, but for India it loomed really large, and as you said, the 1962 war for India looms much larger, but if you went to the PLA Museum, People's Liberation Army Museum in Beijing, I don't know what the situation is today, but when I visited it, you saw major displays for what we'll call the so-called wars of aggression by other powers. So there was a war of aggression by the US, which was the Korean War, the war of aggression by the Soviets, the war of aggression by the Japanese. I was looking around for the quote-unquote war of aggression by India exhibit, and you couldn't really find it, because somebody told me it was up on another floor and it was a tiny exhibit, because it didn't loom as large. So I think, as you said, there is this difference. I think obviously it's changed. India is probably more in the mind space than it was when Professor Shirk wrote about this, but nonetheless still seen from a different view than India sees China.
We've also had a couple of questions about the US. One is whether, given reports of China providing Pakistan stealth fighters, shouldn't the US consider selling F-35s to India? Another from Ashok is, are India and the US engaging on China's increasing activities in India's neighborhood?
With the F-35 question, I wish that I could phone a friend, one of our guests perhaps, who've been on the show, Joshua White, Raji Rajagopalan, or Walter Ladwig, who work on this much more closely. I'll just say that it's not clear, for example, that India necessarily wants F-35s, either because of the cost or because India tends to have its own indigenous option. But it might, in the future, depending on a sense of urgency, etc., that would require India to make certain choices with regard to, for example, the Russian equipment it has, or other options to make this a more palatable offer for the US to make. In the meantime, you do have a number of other allies and partners who do much more readily want that aircraft. So I think that that's a question that will be debated for a while, but it would require the kind of choices it's not clear that India either wants to or could make at this stage or in the near term. On the question of India's neighborhood and are India and the US engaging, yes, they are. This is the one place the increasing intensity of the China challenge has changed how India sees not just the activities of the US, but other like-minded partners like Japan, Australia, Britain, France in South Asia. I think there was a traditional sense, as you know, of a bit of a, in the US, we would think of as a Monroe Doctrine, which is this is our neighborhood and other external powers should essentially stay out. I think what you've seen now is China's activities and influence have grown in South Asia, not just in Pakistan, but across the board in every one of India's near neighborhood. You've seen India change its attitude towards the other partner and saying, look, India no longer has a monopoly. It's a more competitive space, as one of our other guests, Constantino Xavier, has pointed out. And therefore, while it can provide some alternatives, it cannot necessarily match the scale or the speed of what China is doing. And so it's become more open to partnerships. So you've seen this on the economic side with, for example, India facilitating the US Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact with Nepal. You've seen India welcoming the US-Maldives Defense Agreement from a few years ago, which would have been unheard of a few years before that. Or you've seen more recently the Development Finance Corporation from the US finance a port development project in Sri Lanka that will be undertaken by an Indian company. And so you've seen these ways that I think are different and a departure from the past. This doesn't mean that India and the US agree on the neighborhood. I think there's been a fair bit of discussion on, for example, the differences between India and the US on Bangladesh and the recent elections there. Nonetheless, I think what you've seen is the two countries be willing to manage those differences and consult with each other. So there are these kind of regional consultations now. I think the other thing to watch is not just India-US consultations and coordination, maybe even collaboration in India's immediate neighborhood, but in its extended neighborhood. So in the Middle East, or what India calls West Asia, or Southeast Asia, or the Indian Ocean region more broadly. And I think you've seen the announcement of an Indian Ocean dialogue. It'll be interesting to see where that goes in the months and years ahead. While we're talking about the region, we've also had a question flipping the regional dominance question around from Yudhishthir, who asks, how come China hasn't been able to cement its place as a, quote, regional hegemon like the US and North America? And he asked, is it because of geography, effective balancing by other actors? Tara, what's your view?
Which would have been the case.
So, China is the top trading partner of most of the countries in the region. It's actually the top trading partner of 120 countries in the world. So it's developed a strategy of some kind of an economic dominance, or at least interdependency. But it has also gone to war with India. It's gone to war with Vietnam. It's seen as a coercive actor. And so I think countries in the region, when they say, while talking about Indo-Pacific strategies, that they don't want to be forced to choose, it really is about that. It's that they can't afford really to turn away from China, but at the same time, they know that what China is aspiring to or is providing them as a model is not something that they adhere to completely. And so we're in this situation where everyone is balancing. I think that's the complexity of the world that we're seeing now, and I would say particularly since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. We're seeing multiple layers of complexity. It's not just a zero-sum game. It's not because other partners or countries are growing stronger that some are growing weaker. It's just that everyone simultaneously is growing stronger. And so what we're seeing about China is that it is also being confronted to this. I think it had hoped to become not really a regional hegemon. China aspires to be a global hegemon. I think that's also the reality, and we're seeing this being asserted in official documents, global security initiatives, global development initiatives, of course the Belt and Road Initiative, which has existed now for the past 10 years. We have no idea what the real figures around the Belt and Road are. At the very beginning of the initiative, it was said that the whole budget of it, loans and grants, would be around $900 billion. I don't know if that is true. There are some ways to track concretely whether some of the roads and and ports and highways have actually been constructed. But to know whether these were grants or loans, once again, we don't really know. The debt question around the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a huge one. And I think a number of partners and countries in the region to China have also they've come back from their enthusiasm of it, because it is true that originally China's proposition was very appealing. We're coming to you with loans and grants to help you build your country, build concrete infrastructure, contribute to economic growth, provide jobs for your population, and contrary to the US and Europe, we will ask for nothing in return. There'll be no post-colonial agenda. We won't be asking for us to share values. We're just making you a business proposition that is mutually beneficial, and it's what they call a win-win situation. I think what we've seen here again is that that is not always true. Some of the conditional loans, particularly in some countries in Africa, have been impossible to reimburse for countries in the region, and there's a huge question about whether the CCP and the Chinese government knew this from the start. And so what they've been doing is agreeing, in quote, to cancel the debts in exchange for some critical infrastructure that the country would give them. One example that I have in mind is Djibouti, where they now have a military base. They've been doing this little by little in a number of countries, so there is a true strategy there. Once again, in the region, countries see that. They're lucid about it, they're not naive. But they say themselves, we can't afford to turn our back on China, we can't afford to turn it away. It wouldn't make sense for us. We have to live in this world where we're working with China, we're working with the US, we're working with India, we're working with the ASEAN. We're interested in what the Europeans have to offer from an economic standpoint. And we have to live with all of this, which I think is also fine. It's just the reality of the situation. I think it's much harder for us in the West because we did think for a long time of things as just a zero-sum game. I think we'll have to look at all these multiple complex layers and understand and assess what are the interests of all of our partners. And if we push them to choose, I'm afraid they might not choose us. In terms of balancing again, there's a question
there was a raging insurgency,
which is the Quad. Noting that that grouping of Australia, India, Japan, and the US has raised China's hackles. One listener, Pravir, asks, given the largely unstructured, for example, it does not have a secretariat, and non-military, at least not overtly, nature of the Quad, is it right to believe that Quad is meant to balance China? Moreover, even if it is to some extent meant to balance China, isn't the balancing behavior of Quad members more of a buck passing?
Objectives you mentioned.
I think I would actually say that the Quad isn't about buck passing, it's about burden sharing.
Consolidates his
and
position.
It's about four countries, four maritime democracies who do have a shared vision of the Indo-Pacific, want to see the rules-based order prevail, want to see countries having the freedom to choose,
are saying exactly what
for countries that have concerns and shared concerns, though not identical concerns, about what poses a challenge to that vision of the region. It's not the only challenge, but they do see, I think, one of the primary challenges as a rising China's assertive behavior. So it's not just about China's rise, its capabilities, but the way it's been behaving in terms of coercion and potential conflict in the region. So I think you have four countries who have this shared vision, have a shared sense of the challenge, and also all recognize that no one country can or wants to deal with that challenge on its own. And so I think what you've seen the Quad try to do is have two lines of effort. One is a whole set of activities around shaping a favorable balance of power in the region, which contributes to deterrence, shapes China's calculations. But I think there should be an understanding the Quad alone can't do this. So it's part of the network of alliances, coalitions, and partnerships that is shaping that favorable balance of power and therefore tries to shape China's calculations. I think the second line of effort is building resilience in the region. Whether that is in terms of countries' capacities for maritime security, whether that's in the health space or the climate space, the idea being for countries to be able to have an ability to detect challenges deny those challenges as well as have the capacity to respond to challenges that emerge. So I think what this is these four countries realizing it makes sense for countries to, in a resource-constrained environment, to try to share that burden since they do share a vision, the sense of challenge, and the idea that it's not worth doing alone. So you don't think of the European-style collective defense of the Cold War approach, but think of collaborative security as what the Quad is trying to do across the board. As the Quad says, it's a force for public good, so health security, climate security, maritime security in terms of combating illegal and unreported fishing as well.
But let's start
now we have one more question on the balancing strategy front, this time from the mysterious Mr. A, related to India's balancing strategy vis-a-vis China that traditionally included a role for Russia, which is now partnering with Beijing. It follows up on our episode with Nivedita Kapoor on India's view of China-Russia ties. The listener asks, will India be able to re-accommodate Russia with the Western world in the medium to long term? Tara, is such a Russia-West reset possible, and is there a role to play for India, which wants to stall or reverse deepening Sino-Russian ties?
Ahead of the curve in that sense.
This is
so do you think there was
the question of the moment.
Lessons that
we have actually a collection of essays coming up with colleagues from Brookings about the future of the aid to Ukraine, what Europe and the West can do to support it. But there are questions about Russia in there too. And right now, to be honest, a reset seems not possible. For Europe, the faith of Ukraine is really now tied to its destiny. And so if there is a termination to the war that is in favorable terms to Ukraine and that ensures its security for the long term, I think that would be time then to think about the future of the relationship to Russia, because a number of countries, including my own, say that you can't change geography, Russia is always going to be there on the fence, inside, outside Europe, and so we have to find a way to work with it. Right now, honestly, most European countries really see Russia as the long-term enemy, the long-term adversary. It has had brazen attitudes in Ukraine. It's been destroying the country for the past 2 years, destroying the infrastructure, targeting civilian populations. Putin has said and alluded to not so vaguely about the fact that he could go beyond Ukraine. He could go maybe to NATO member states. And the declarations a few days ago by former President Donald Trump about the fact that he would actually encourage Putin to invade European countries if they were not paying up on defense, I think has really sent chills to everyone in Europe recently. And so, if you listen to Putin, he says the war can end if Ukraine fully capitulates, and then we'll agree to negotiate. I think that is definitely impossible for us. And so we're also talking with a country in front of us that manifestly doesn't want some form of a cooperation or a reset. I'm not saying it's never going to happen, but it is very complicated. Where I see a shared interest for Europeans and Americans and India is definitely in wanting to stall deepening Sino-Russian ties. And I would say in the European case in particular, because Europe has been fairly scared by a number of American declarations on China. I would say particularly last year with the balloon incident and the acceleration of tensions. We saw a moment where war with China was actually evoked here in Washington fairly openly in a way that it is absolutely not in Europe. And Europe doesn't want to give up totally on its economic and trade relationship with China, but it definitely sees now these deepening Sino-Russian ties as having terrible consequences on its relationship with China. So I think this is one area where if India wanted to act more, wanted to be more open, I think there would be space for Europeans to want that, because India is definitely in this very unique position where it feels like it's equidistant with Europe, the US and Russia in a way that no other country is in the world right now. And it seems that from the outside at least that it has these access almost in an equal manner. So if there was a way in which Modi or the Indian government could lean on Putin, I think that would definitely be helpful. I think India we still maintain dignity out of all this. But when you look at Pakistan's media, I was one of the major
kind
European
of amazed or
Germany,
laughed at
the most important economic power,
when they actually went on to the extent of dramatizing the whole victimhood
I don't see it giving up. It's already given up on its dependency on Russian oil in the past 2 years.
Anchors weeping on the screen,
if it gives up on the economic relationship with China, then it seriously puts its economic might at risk.
India is being
and in a way, the centrality of Germany in the European system is also linked to its economic might. So if suddenly Germany is not so central economically, it might lose some of its centrality in political terms, and that also totally changes the balance of power in Europe. So all these things have consequences and ramifications, but I think we have a shared interest in stalling these deepening Sino-Russian ties, though I have to be honest, if I look at the news, analyze what we're seeing, we're looking at an increasingly isolated Russia, counting indeed on China, on Iran, on North Korea.
Under the direct ISI oversight.
This doesn't seem like a country that wants to find a way out of the situation with partners. So I'm not saying that we should totally give up.
But I'm just picking up
diplomacy should do what it's supposed to do, but it does seem that we are at a bit of an impasse right now.
Tours of nuclear sites.
From European scenarios to Indo-Pacific ones, we have a question from listener Vague, which is, could India's position on Taiwan evolve if there are additional developments at the Sino-Indian border?
We spoke a little bit about this on our episode on Tibet and Taiwan with our colleague Ryan Haas. I think you've already seen India's position on Taiwan evolve in at least two ways since China-India ties have deteriorated. One is that it has become somewhat less cautious about commenting on or talking about Taiwan in general. And even in terms of, as I mentioned in that episode, Indian ministers appearing at Taiwanese companies' inaugurations in India, or Taiwan just becoming a more visible both actor and getting a lot more coverage in India. So much more Taiwan awareness in India and in the Indian government, but also because of developments in the last few years around the Taiwan Strait, has been a bit more vocal on the issue, even if not as vocal as some would like. But I think the second way you've seen India's position in Taiwan evolve, thanks to its concerns about China, is on the de-risking front. So you've seen India want to de-risk its economy, and part of that is doing it through diversification, but also indigenization. And so this idea of encouraging not just Western companies to come invest in India, but also Taiwanese ones. And so I think you've seen this both in the computer space as well as in the phone space. And so electronics more broadly, where you've seen Taiwanese companies show renewed interest in India. So I think you've already seen how developments at the border have a direct line to how India sees these issues. But I think in the future, you can also see developments at the border playing a role. How and in what direction depends on the context. If there's another escalation by China at the border, you could see it cement these trends, and India's competition with China further make it much more open about where it stands on these issues, keeping in mind that China remains an Indian neighbor. But on the other hand, you could argue that if there's an escalation at the border, it could also absorb more of India's resources and attention. So I think it depends on the circumstances. It also depends on who is in power at the time and what their judgments are on the same set of facts, for example, about what would be helpful in terms of tackling their challenge at the border.
And then,
we've been talking a fair bit about the Indo-Pacific, but looking beyond the
without
region,
understanding what exactly had happened.
Why are both
and
China
even the
and
news
India
channels were so dumb that they did not clarify. So my question is,
for moral gains, he
all
asks,
of this
what
happened.
does the global
Now,
South have to offer? And between China and India, is there a front runner?
We alluded to earlier in our discussion to this fragmentation of the world and the fact that countries don't want to choose.
It wasn't exaggerated
we're not in a bipolar world anymore. We're not in a tripolar world. Some people in Europe really don't like that when we say it, but we are somehow in a multipolar world. At least countries don't want to choose. And so India and China are racing to the global South, I think, because they realize that a number of countries will want to work with India, the US, Europe, Russia, Indonesia. they will not want to choose. They'll see where their interests lie and what proposition, what offer can be made to them. And so for me, actually, the proposition goes way beyond moral gains. I think there's a true economic trade interest here, sometimes a security interest, maybe a holistic view of security. If you multiply partners, then you're less at risk suddenly of failing on the dependency on one of them, but also if you have a multiplicity of them, then one of them might be less willing to attack you. So I think there is also a sense that you protect yourself by talking to and working with a number of partners. Still a sense in the way that economic interdependency works. We know the vulnerabilities.
Yes, so coming back
we know
to
what dangers they might represent, but at the same time, strength comes in numbers. And so I think both India and China are very conscious of that, and they see opportunities there. I think China has made a clearer proposition. The BRI is one of those examples.
But
they have to figure out some
people
way
in the
of doing
global
it.
south
But
know that
they
they come with caveats.
So narrative
The Chinese proposition is not perfect, but it has the advantage of being laid out. And so the reality of the situation, and that goes beyond the global south, is that China has a stake now in more than 60 ports in the world. They don't control it fully, but they have stakes basically in major maritime routes, in major trade routes, and we've seen how that impacts China. China, at a moment when the Red Sea was really under a lot of pressure a few weeks ago, it didn't act as much as it could have on the international stage, but it did react and say something. And so you could see that China also identifies very clearly when its interests are at risk. I think India has yet to make that proposition. Last year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said he wanted India to be one of the voices of the global south. In a way, that's also a proposition to say there's not one global south, there are multiplicity of voices. India can be one amongst many, it can bring or carry others with it. But I think that's already, of course, a very different message. The question is, can India make a concrete proposition when it comes to infrastructure and economic gains? Because I think that's still what people are looking for. I think the Chinese proposition is out there. We know that it's not fully efficient, but at least it's clear. I think India still has to make a case. Between them, is there a front runner? Again, I think because the Chinese proposition is clearer, a number of countries want to go, but they also don't want to have to choose between India and China. I think we're also getting to that stage where the question that we get from a lot of partners is, why would we have to choose? There's one proposition from China where we would get all of these materials, all of these roads, and there's one proposition with India, which has now a larger voice on the international stage. And if suddenly we are supported by India to be a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council or to be more active on the international stage, well, that helps us. And why would they be mutually exclusive? I think that India has probably a card to play here too, just to say, well, this is not about choosing, it's about making the best of each of these propositions for everyone. I think what is clear is that for now, neither the US nor Europe have made a good offer to the global south, a good concrete offer. One small part of it is the IMEC, which was proposed at the G20 in Delhi last year.
That's a you problem, not a
India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which is meant to link India, the Middle East, Europe through connectivity. I think in a way clearly an alternative to the BRI, but we have yet to see what funding comes from that, how concretely they're going to do it. The concrete proposition needs to come out of it, and also we see now developments in the Middle East that it's not so easy to make it come to fruition. So I think
that there is a big protest happening in the air headquarters.
And of course, there are things India can offer, not just a loan, but in places like Africa, which one of our listeners, Tamiru, asked about.
Perfect electricity was coming. So if there is
including European partners, American partners, Japanese, and others who are also thinking about offering alternatives in that region in particular.
This is a professional ISPR.
We've also received two kinds of questions in the economic domain, but on the bilateral front this time. The first cluster involves, is India making the right moves to compete with China, particularly on the manufacturing front? And do some of its initiatives make more sense strategically than economically?
Was more proactive in clarifying those a strategic prism is now shaping India's economic and technology-related choices. But not just India's choices. I think that is the reality today, and it can't be wished away. Several countries are now thinking about these issues as strategic choices. This is something, in fact, China pioneered in this era. Essentially, it was decoupling while others were still talking about interdependence. But I think you've also seen other countries now seeing these as strategic choices.
Nobody really knows that something has happened.
It is something that Beijing's behavior has brought on, something you alluded to earlier. Its economic coercion or use of its economic levers to shape countries' strategic and political choices has meant that countries like India see economic ties with China now much more as a vulnerability than as an opportunity, which they did in the past. So I think there is no doubt that these are now not just economic choices, but strategic choices. I think that will remain the case.
The first point I'd like to make is that
the overall thing, one of the things that India's approach has been more broadly, I think you've seen essentially India's economic security approach involve three prongs. One is limiting Chinese access to certain strategic sectors. The second is indigenization or reshoring. And the third is diversification or friendshoring. And I think you see this play out in the manufacturing space as well. I know there are some who say India shouldn't even be getting involved in increasing manufacturing. I don't think that's tenable for India, and I don't think it's kind of politically or from a political economy perspective tenable as well. So I think you have seen in that indigenization prong and in the diversification prong, you've seen the Indian government take some steps on the manufacturing front to try to attract investments, set up these production-linked incentive schemes. There's some debate about how effective they are. I think some sectors have been more effective than others. And so you've seen India also try to build resilience in this space, try to attract or become part of global value chains in certain sectors. And I think you've seen the Modi government try to invest in and build on what its predecessors did in terms of infrastructure and logistics to make it more attractive. Also signed some economic agreements or start renegotiating them, which had been stalled earlier, to try to overcome some of the trade barriers that have existed. Having said that, I do think India could do more in this manufacturing space. Broader improvements in the business environment would help. I think a changed attitude towards imports, not just seeing exports as good and imports are bad, but recognizing the connection between them. And I think also providing more regulatory certainty to companies who these days do have other places to invest in. And so some might say, India is the only option. That's not necessarily the case. And I think more broadly, what I would argue is that India shouldn't just be making the proposition that it's the non-China, but that India should be making the effective case that India is worth investing in or trading with or partnering with because it's India, and that proposition itself is attractive.
The second kind of bilateral economic question we've received is actually from the opposite
someone had done something. So in various
Bjorn
interviews
notes that the PRC and Chinese company will be crucial for the future rise of India and asks, how do you assess the potential of future economic cooperation between the two states?
What exactly?
For the reasons I mentioned, India will continue to look with skepticism at massively increasing economic ties with China. Even before the 2020 border crisis that we talked about a lot this season, as our guest Ashok Malik pointed out, and our guests on the technology episodes, Trisha Ray and Pranay Kothastani pointed out, India was concerned about the imbalance in ties between the two countries. And so you could see, for instance, that if the two countries find a way to stabilize the situation at the border, you could see an India that's more open to Chinese investment or projects in non-strategic sectors, but not in any sectors that India considers critical. And I think this is going to be particularly true in the technology or telecommunications
what does the country do?
And I think you will see maybe some adjustments partly because of India's effort to attract investment from other countries, more like-minded countries. You might see India make some adjustments in terms of allowing certain kinds of imports from China or certain kinds of training personnel from China to come help build capacity in India. We're already seeing some shift there, some openness. But that's from a pragmatic perspective. I don't think you're going to go back to the days of, at least in the near term or even medium term, of India really seeing China as an economic partner to build its future. I think you'll see some increase perhaps in imports from China in the near term, but I think slowly you will see the percentage of imports from China, percentage of India's entire imports potentially fall over time, and I think you'll see the content of those imports change.
And secondly, the doctrine says
now,
that
as somewhat related positive trends or cooperation question we received is from listener Debasmith, who says they have, quote, observed positive aspects of China from many Indian vloggers, showcasing world-class infrastructure and happy citizens, yet contrasting narratives suggest government oppression. Could you please shed light on the reality, unquote? And relatedly, another question that we got from a listener has been on how to learn about Chinese perspectives, since one usually hears a lot more about Indian and Western perspectives.
The whole world is affected.
That's a hard question. These are hard questions, actually. So, as I said, it is true that there are a lot of people in India, not very recently, but a few years ago, who would say, well, something has to be said for the efficiency of the Chinese system, the Chinese economy, the attractivity of it, precisely because there were all these infrastructures. What we're seeing now is that China has played a bit too much into the infrastructure hand, and so we're seeing real estate companies really crumble. We're seeing a number of infrastructure that were built, and particularly I'm thinking of high-rises, buildings that people paid for that will never fully be built now, that will not be given to the people who paid for it. Part of the economy is really being severely hit in China by this. And happy citizens, this puzzles me a bit more. I can see the infrastructure issue. I think there is a point in that. There were bullet trains in China a long time ago.
You spoke of Malir.
Happy citizens, I believe a bit less, because I think China really has been an authoritarian regime for a long time. And under Xi Jinping, we've seen this authoritarian turn actually go to the worst. And a number of Chinese scholars now say openly that China is a dictatorship. So, no capacity to protest on the citizen side, a lot of control coming from the propaganda machine in terms of the information that is going into China. We all know about the internet firewall, a lot of control of what is given to Chinese citizens in terms of information. We've seen the zero COVID policy also. I think we've seen a very, very harsh Chinese government implement very harsh policies on its own citizens, blocking access, forcing them to take COVID tests on a daily basis, not letting them travel as they want inside the country. We've seen if citizens are not behaving correctly, they get punished for it. So if they don't get proper points on the social system, then they're not allowed to travel as they want. They can't go out of the country. The level of control on the population is huge. So I'm certain there are people who are happy in China, but the idea that there are happy citizens and that's the reality, I'm a lot more skeptical on, and I think it's also very dangerous to propagate that message because it is false. And it's extremely hard for scholars working on China to go in China right now. It's extremely hard for them to actually do field work and to be able to reflect and to tell the rest of the world what is happening. This is something that has been decided very consciously by the Chinese government. Once again, the idea for Xi Jinping is really to make the world dependent on China while making China independent of the world. And so we need to understand that. This is not to say that you need to write China off, but I think you need to be conscious and lucid and understand what the situation is on the ground. Chinese coercion is a reality. I mean, we've seen it. Australia was one of China's largest trading partners because it asked for an investigation on the origins of the COVID virus. Suddenly, there was a ban on a number of products that Australia needed from China. And it was from one day to another, very harsh situations. China regularly opens up these controversies on the borders, and so last summer it released a map where Arunachal Pradesh suddenly was part of China, but actually the Philippines and Malaysia also contested that. So you see a government that, I guess, is not just coming with good intentions. I think the question about the Chinese perspectives is really, really important. And a lot of Chinese scholars have also not been able to come to America and Europe. And I know that there are a number of think tanks and organizations now actually working to get some Chinese scholars to come here to renew contacts, at least people-to-people exchanges, because these are absolutely crucial. I would say just on the human level, they're important. But if you think of the role that China plays on the international stage, and clearly that ambitions to play even more, we need to understand these perspectives. We get some of the Chinese journals, we read them, but I think the people-to-people contact are really crucial. And they're even more crucial at a time where actually the control on people coming from the government side is increasing day by day. We've reached with China a state that has instituted state capitalism and digital control, almost full digital control of its population. So it is going to be hard, but we definitely need these Chinese perspectives, and we need to be able to provide them with our own perspectives as a pacified way as possible.
I think you've seen efforts in the US, at least that I'm aware of these great translation projects, which is taking the writings that we do have that are in Mandarin and translating them. So you get a wider access. Of course, there's a problem that some data has been made now inaccessible.
Going up the escalation ladder.
But I would encourage efforts like that in India if they don't already exist, either alone or in conjunction with other like-minded partners, where you can find ways to pool in these resources. There's some great newsletters now in India from China Watchers that are also worth subscribing to. And so I think you do see that there are ways, but of course, for the reasons you said, a more close society than even it was 5-10 years ago,
is that we have an India-Pakistan.
Finally, we've received a cluster of questions on the potential for a thaw in
nuclear
India-China
CBM,
talks.
which says we will
Might
not
there
strike
be a mutually
each
agreed
other's
cool
nuclear
down to the current
facilities,
face-off?
and that we
Sinhan, for
exchange
instance, asks, how can both states build trust and mutual understanding? And there's also a question, will they ever resolve China's border
nuclear facilities.
So I think the resolution of the border dispute is some ways away, but let me tackle that
I'm just asking
question.
Kirana Hills is not part.
And the reason I'm going to tackle this, and it's perhaps a good question towards the end of this episode, because it's a question I get the most in the US these days, which is, are China and India going to reach some sort of grand bargain or settlement? I think what you could see is some sort of cool down in the sense of what the US and Australia and others are doing, which is a stabilization effort to set a floor in the relationship, to ensure that you don't see a crisis escalation again. But that would require one of the two countries, or perhaps both, to move a little from what their positions have been. India's position has been, as long as the situation at the border is not normal, the border relationship can't go to normal. China has said, set aside what happened at the border and just move on. And so there has to be some gives. The question is a cool down possible? Yes. But on what and whose terms? And so I think you could see that. Now, what I think this effort for a thaw would require in part is, for example, on the Chinese side, perhaps a recalculation of the situation it faces. One is you could see a China that feels under pressure from the US, an assessment that things might get worse under President Trump, or at least it would be much more uncertain, but also a China that's facing more economic headwinds that you mentioned earlier, that China says, okay, I want to ease this front a bit, at least for the short to medium term. A thaw would require some sort of recalculation from China. From India's perspective, I think you could see an argument in India to say yes to that kind of dialogue that China might propose, stemming from a desire for more space and time to do the things it wants to do to be able to grow in strength, for example, and be able to balance China in other ways. I think Indian policymakers also don't want a crisis. It's unpredictable. You don't know how it might pan out. So I think efforts to prevent such a crisis through dialogue might be palatable or even attractive to India. I think the other thing is you could see some in India concerned about other countries, whether the US, Japan, Australia, even Europe, actually having these dialogues with China and becoming concerned about defection, so to speak, that others are going to leave India holding the bag. And so you might see some calls for that reason. And then finally, I think India would also be thinking about the prospect of a second Trump presidency and the uncertainty that would bring. And just like in the fall of 2017, where you saw India agreeing to Chinese efforts to reach out to stabilize ties, you could see that, though I think 2020 has changed things. So what I think you might see, if you see these circumstances, particularly after the Indian election, because I think any such agreement, even in India, to have this discussion beyond a certain point, it would have to be a government that's more politically comfortable. So post-election, where government has a mandate and a China that's actually making an effort. So that's something for the Indian leadership to show to the Indian public. I think then you could see some sort of dialogue stabilization effort, but I find it hard to believe that you're going to see some major structural shift or grand bargain between India and China. Their differences aren't just about the border. That is not going to be resolved anytime soon. It's not even clear that both sides might disengage at the border standoff points. It's unlikely that they will de-escalate in a significant fashion or at least to pre-2020 levels. And even if you resolve the border tomorrow, there are all the other issues, including competition in the global south, in the Indian Ocean region, not to mention China strengthening India's rival Pakistan, for instance, or the economic differences that the two sides have.
Yes,
so stabilization maybe, but not a structural change in the fundamental competition between the two Asian giants. With that, Tara, I want to ask you a question, a lightning round question that we end all our episodes with, which is, what is the biggest myth or misunderstanding you hear about India-China ties in Europe?
I think the biggest misunderstanding is mostly due to ignorance, to be honest. I think there is little sense in Europe, even in major European capitals that have special ties with India, of what India's foreign policy priorities are. And so I think people really underestimate or just don't know about how China is central to India's strategic thinking and how the 1962 defeat is central to it and how it's really built the future of its foreign policy. But I think people also really don't know, at least didn't know until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, of the closeness of India-Russia ties and how now the India-Russia-China triangle is making India's life very complicated, not just with itself, but also with its partners. And so I think that's mostly maybe India not communicating it enough and maybe us not understanding it enough.
With zero humility, I would suggest that if they do want more information, they should listen to the entirety of season 1 of our Global India podcast, which we are now concluding with this episode. I want to thank our team here at Brookings that has helped put this together, but also I want to thank our audience that has listened along for the whole seasons. If you do have questions about the season, please do email us at globalindia@brookings.edu. But with that, let me sign off, and thanks to all our listeners.
Is not about the canals. Now people are being told that.
Thank you for tuning in to the Global India podcast. I'm Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. You can find research about India and more episodes of this show on our website, brookings.edu/globalindia.
But in this case,
my thanks to the production team, including Kubileleni Hawanga, supervising producer, Fed Jews and Ramanpreet Kaur, producers, Gaston Reybaredo, audio engineer, and Daniel Morales, video editor. My thanks also to Alexandra Dimsdale and Hannah Foreman for their support, and to Shivanti Mendes, who designed the show art. Additional support for the podcast comes from my colleagues in the Foreign Policy Program and the Office of Communications at Brookings.
Asim Munir gets his extension. He's already signed on for 2 more years. I mean, that's there. And I think the only thing now is to see whether he gets 2 more years. And, or not 2 more years, any number of more years.
I am Landry Signé, Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program and the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institute.
Already got an extension till 27.
Welcome to the Foresight Africa podcast, where I engage with distinguished leaders in policy, business, academia, and civil society to share their unique insights and innovative solutions to Africa's challenges, while highlighting opportunities to advance engagement between Africa, the US, and the global community.
And
you can learn more about this show and our work at brookings.edu/Foresight Africa
sympathetic
podcast.
voices within
Today,
Pakistan for
we
Baloch
are
nationalism
sharing a
will also
special
track it down.
episode
There'll be no
of the
sympathy
Foresight
now
Africa
because,
podcast,
India is now
recorded during
arch
the
enemy,
week of
and
April
that's how it
21st
is.
on site at
So
the
this is
International
what there
Monetary
is.
Fund and
And I think
World
actually
Bank
what we have to,
2025
I mean, I listen to
spring
everybody here.
meetings.
Very interesting.
Each year,
But,
leaders from
but I
around
also
the
think we
globe
have to
converge
really wait
in
for more
Washington,
information to
D.C.
come out from both
for the
sides. I
spring
think
meetings
not all
to
information has
discuss
come
the
out. Some of
state
you may be
of the
privy to
world economy
more
and
information
ways
than
in
I
which
am.
central bankers, finance
I
ministers,
still think that
civil
much of it has to
society
come out in the public realm
representatives,
for it to
and
actually
academics can
be
work
assessed
together
properly,
to provide
what really
solutions to today's
some of you
most complex
obviously seem to know
financial
more.
issues.
So I'll just end there.
This year's theme was
Nirupama, if I might just ask you a follow-up. Let me just clarify once again. They've already passed the law.
And my team
Yes, I know that.
caught up with 7 high-level officials
coming up right now.
during
He's already
the
got
week
extension
to
in
get
in
key
November, that process
takeaways
has to be gone
from the
through.
meetings.
It's not. It's
You can find the full
It's a 5-year term now
interviews
for an
with
army chief.
each
yes,
of
it
today's
is. But
guests
that formality
at
has to be gone through still in November.
brookings.edu/foresight
The question, however,
meetings.
is
My first guest
I just wanted to understand from you, what do you think is happening inside Pakistan,
Senior
where
Managing Director at the World
there is
Bank,
absolutely no questions being asked about what has happened.
His key takeaways,
you know, in the sense that nobody's asking, have 11 air bases been hit? Nobody's asking what happened to our air.
My name is Axel van Trotzenberg. I'm the Senior Managing Director at the World Bank.
So it's very easy to take pot shots at Indian media.
The first is clearly what you see is that we have been single-mindedly focused on the jobs agenda, creating jobs, largely also driven by the concern that not enough jobs will be created in the developing countries, and that could leave many youths without jobs in the future, and that should be a common concern to all of us. And the good news is that resonated enormously with our shareholders. Of course, primarily the developing countries, clearly concerned about this, but also developed countries, to see that this jobs agenda needs to be addressed, and that I think is good news. We got very strong support in the development committee for that agenda, and we are taking this forward, and I'm very pleased about that outcome. Second outcome is this is an organization that is also, of course, providing a lot of financing to developing countries, and here half of the financing comes from the International Development Association, that is the fund for our poorest countries, and we had successfully negotiated a big package at the end of last year that needed now to go through formal processes, and by the spring meetings 147 countries have now voted in favor of the IDA 21 replenishment resolution. This is important because that allows us to start implementing this package as of July 1st. So very happy about that. So that are the two major takeaways. Then the other thing that we have been showcasing here in the MC is clearly the knowledge agenda and the data agenda that we are pursuing. You see what we are doing with data, with outcome measurement, but also promoting a discussion on key development issues, this time clearly centered around the jobs agenda. So it gives people a bit of a sense that we will seek ideas, we are promoting debate, and we hope through that debate that we all rally for action.
You saw Najam Sethi call it a false flag. People were calling
Remember, you can find Axel van Trotzenberg's full remarks and the other full sets of remarks from everyone you are hearing on this episode on our website, brookings.edu/.
He also did a program where he said Kasab had been arrested in Nepal by the Ra, and Ra had brought him to Delhi. Many other
he
is that kind of a journalist. Everybody knows what kind of a journalist he is. But Soumya, you and General
Shukla
had a point, so please go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to something which Nirupama highlighted about
rising global debt
media is questioning the army there, and so were they questioned. Media in India was also questioning the armed forces. But the difference between the two nations and the army of the two nations is we followed a very professional method of communication. Even when we talk about STRATCOM, I feel thank you to General Shukla who reminded me of the role played by the armed forces when it came to strategic communication. And also throughout the operation, from day one till last day, every day there was a press briefing where we were going with evidence, with satellite imagery, which was unbiased in nature, and we talked to the audience. There were journalists who were actually asking questions in flesh and blood. So it's not that they were, they gag and they let's leave them alone because that's their nature. But if we are comparing the two armies, then we must recognize that how proactively the armed forces were here, the tri-services when I speak.
The same African countries which are now facing very difficult situation in terms of accessing concessional resources.
Sometimes because of the way the information cycles run,
affecting the African
we come to premature wrong
almost 5%
like on that first night, I think Marshal Jahangir
and going up now. It's a very tough situation.
Who is doing all that?
It's a very tough situation.
So he gave a lovely
exchange ideas,
he gave a lovely theory
this kind of environment.
PL-15 and J-10
what should happen?
AVIX shares rising.
We're always happy to come here
so good
in Washington
on the first night, what happened on the second
to exchange with the IMF.
And now they have said that
that is looking at the growth and the key constraints and the facilities that can help member countries to stabilize, especially the balance of payments, and also in terms of development.
And उस दिन कह रहे थे AVIX shares ऊपर जा रहे हैं
the
Chinese company.
Today they followed by 10%.
So you have to wait for some things to settle down.
With them,
so on current evidence, it does seem to me,
harmonizing our
and
programs,
here I must say this whatever you call it, 4-day affair has been won by air power.
On the African continent that works with all the 54 countries.
And the AD war,
so when we come here, we also come to share our own experiences.
The S-400s
We've seen that with the aid declining, with the debt levels being very high and the need for more resources for climate,
we have really done well
to do things differently. And one of them is the focusing on the domestic resource mobilization, which we discussed at length with the managing director of the IMF and also other participants, especially the African countries.
The executive secretary made clear just how important the spring meetings are for bringing together diverse actors necessary to deliver results for African economies.
Spring meetings brings together all the experts,
and the defense minister,
all the decision makers. Here you have the ministers, you have financial institutions, you have think tanks, you have academia, you have everybody.
Signaling,
for example, one of the panel that was moderating the team that was put together by the Secretary General to look at the debt and what needs to be done. As you know, that debt has had a lot of challenges because right now for the countries which are highly indebted,
I think that was the alarming intelligence
with the COVID, where people were just borrowing to save lives. So this is the place where you come together and be able to exchange with others. There are many sessions going on. You pick and choose what you think is more relevant. But I think it's a good area where we come together and be able to discuss what is happening at this moment in time, especially the issues of tariffs and other things which are happening, of which ECA has done a comprehensive study on this one here, and the impact it is having on Africa, and what are the alternatives.
Victory and defeat.
Given the theme of
like
this year's spring meetings, the big impact for Africa under discussion
we can convince ourselves
jobs.
About so many things.
My next guest explain why creating new jobs in Africa is so important.
Drowned by the rhetoric of or the statements and the repeated
I am Harold Tavares, Executive Director for African Group 2,
They're saying the same thing.
EDS 13 at the World Bank Group.
They have called
My biggest takeaway is it's about the team that was for the spring meeting jobs, because the most important thing to fight poverty is to create jobs for people, in particular to young people and women. And that's my biggest takeaway.
So they are as happy as we are.
That's the way to fight poverty. And to eliminate poverty is to give opportunity. And look at the countries that I represent, particularly to the young people. I say all the time, they have talents. The people, the young people, the women, they have great talents, but what they're missing is the opportunity. And we need to give them the opportunity, and give them opportunity is to bring jobs. And that means job is to create a vibrant private sector. And that's where I think this is a big step away from the spring meeting, as we promote jobs and we promote private sector.
I think why did they start doing this nuclear signaling,
2025
this convening of the NCA, was when they saw the Syria lying in tatters.
Institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, central banks,
airfields are taken off and your aircraft can't take off.
This meeting is an opportunity for us to come together. Multilateralism is this best. And we'll meet here, we'll discuss, and we share the same goals. It's one goal, one mission, and that mission is to eradicate extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity on a livable planet. And that's our mission and our goal, as well as a multilateralism. And this is where everything happens. And this shows you the multilateralism works. And so I think particularly in the time that we're facing today, multiple challenge, we have really very optimistic as I see this gathering. I see the passion on development, and a lot of people have very happy that we have accomplished a lot, but there's a lot of way to go. And I'm looking forward to what's coming ahead, as it seems a very
What are the lessons learned apart from the fact that we can use force? The most important question
African governments and central banks were well represented at the spring meetings, taking the opportunity to promote their advances,
the technological
prowess
of the armed forces,
opportunities.
Or we will say, fine, we have won.
So my name is Soraya Hakuzereme. I'm the governor of the National Bank of Rwanda, which is Rwanda's central bank. And prior to that, I had been deputy governor for 4 years. And prior to that, trade and industry minister during the COVID time.
We have another country on the east.
Just to show you how challenges in me are one.
Very keen to
there are many takeaways from these spring meetings of both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And from a central bank's perspective, I think what's important was for us, as you know, to get a sense of
what is the message for them,
what the outlook for the economy is globally, but also for our own region, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then Rwanda in particular. And these spring meetings come at a time of great uncertainties in the economy, geopolitical tensions, as we know, trade wars and announcement of tariffs that have created or heightened uncertainties, as well as at a time where Africa is also in the middle of accelerating its own continental integration. So when we look at the outlook for the global economy, unfortunately the forecast was not positive because it has been downgraded because of those different tensions and uncertainties. But at least we can be assured that Sub-Saharan Africa will continue to grow in 2025. Same for Rwanda. We expect a growth in 2025 of around 7%, which is still a very high growth. We expect our inflation to remain within our band, which is between 2% and 8%, and we expect our inflation around 6.5%. So far things look manageable.
Already from yesterday,
but the risks to those projections are still on the high side. So we continue to be very vigilant and have also been able to engage our partners, multilaterals but also bilaterals, to see how we can continue to build on those strong macroeconomic indicators, to continue growing our economy in a very, very complicated context, making sure that the central bank keeps, being on top of its mandate, price stability, financial sector stability, but of course all those headwinds remains a risk to that. So let's see what the future holds.
We
but at
really
least
have to step up our budget, or we will discover like Europe or somebody else. Look at our military
the
industry.
governor described how Rwanda was bracing itself
they don't
for
have 7
the
days
effects
of precision
recent shocks to trade and
and
international
China
aid,
is manufacturing 10,000
and
cruise
the
missiles a
National
week.
Bank's supervision
This technology
will
piece,
become even
Atmanirbharta
more
and defense has
important.
started well, but we have a
Yet,
huge weight.
She was also
This
looking
year,
to new
at least 20
possibilities.
defense startups should be given orders.
But we don't want to focus only on risks. There are also opportunities, and that has been discussed on innovation, for instance, in the digital payments space in Africa. How we can enhance, accelerate, but make sure that all our citizens benefit from that. We've seen financial inclusion increase rapidly in Africa and in Rwanda in particular, where in the last 4 years, our financial inclusion rate increased by 15 percentage points from 77% in 2020 to 92%
Everywhere else,
in 2024, but that was driven mainly by mobile money. So we want to build on that access to financial services to make sure that our population get access to insurance products, credit, savings and investment products to really build resilience.
And last point I want to make.
The key word for Africa is building Africa's economic resilience. It's a challenge, but it's also opportunities that we need to grab as a continent and make sure that we can leverage on technology or partnerships
we have rebalanced
to build
to just give it some technology, a little more money. The Chinese are not illogical. At least your LAC will be secure. The larger gap with China, deep on. You have to go into hide and bide, which means wait till you build your capacity. So in an overall sense, if we make
the organization that
we are in a very grim strategic environment, we need to invest in defense to secure India's
World Bank, as well as the annual meetings in
couple
the
of
fall.
quick points on what you asked and
Good
the
afternoon.
lessons.
My name is
One, what we've been saying and what the media has been saying, I think there's a big misunderstanding. The hyphen is back. The hyphen is not back.
Continent.
You know, the hyphen won't be back. This becomes a disincentive that don't do this kind of thing, you'll get hyphenated with Pakistan.
My constituency
the hyphen went in 1999. The moment Clinton took Nawaz Sharif to the White House, scolded him and asked him to get off the Kargil Heights.
Executive
There
Director
again, there was
Sunday
the Indian force at play, which had forced his hand, but the Americans supported that move. So the hyphen is not back. Just because a couple of tweets come mentioning India and Pakistan in the same breath, we should be suddenly feeling that the hyphen is back. The understanding even in this episode in our global diplomacy was that the understanding of the difference between the two countries was very clear in most countries. Second,
there is a sense of betrayal. Major
I think it's not a sense that
maybe not at the level of diplomats.
Yeah, it's
diplomats, but I think there is, if you look at the public space and the public square,
initial
there is a lot of anger and a lot of
might be. As you know,
there's this deep sense of betrayal that the Americans have done what they've always been accused of. They are unreliable, they are untrustworthy, and these are people you should be very aware.
Fair enough. There is that sentiment, but as strategic thinkers or strategic community, we ought to be recognizing it for what it is. You know, we know that Trump is often not even reflecting his own administration's views, leave alone US views. And this might be something that he jumped to take credit for. You know, the same movie was played in 2019. What happened was Pompeo
even countries that are not
credit,
directly affected,
but later, a few months later, when he retired in his memoir, it wasn't that Biden suddenly tweeted, "Oh, I got the ceasefire done and I got the Indians and Pakistanis to stop fighting." But this is a new kind of Trumpian diplomacy, which we have to accept. But we shouldn't really be demoralized and think, "Oh my God, the hyphen is back," because you'll see the trade deal, you'll see lots of stuff coming up.
Policy
and
decisions
India and Pakistan are different. There is no hyphen. So I think that we should be clear on. The second issue on neighborhood, I think salutary effect. What you said about some asset of Pakistan in Bangladesh saying take over the northeast states, or another asset is a member of government. Well, I'm calling him an asset. Another person who might be sitting in Canada, both you and I know Pannu, suddenly says that they can't fly over Punjab. And so, you know, this is warfare, and they are activating different assets to try and speak a language. But the more strategic point here is that this will emphasize to the other neighbors that neighborhood first is a grand bargain. Take care of India's security. That is primary, and we'll take care of your prosperity. But don't interfere with India's security. Don't challenge India's security, because India will be tough on any neighbor who is challenging or threatening India's security. And thirdly, the lesson I would say is the diplomacy will now have to match the military strength and be going in consonance with the military strength, and not the other way around, to face security challenges. And finally, to a little defense of the late Jaswant Singh, you know, and of the Vajpayee regime. You know, they went nuclear. Let's not forget it. In 1998, they took the lead. 99 in Kargil, and I know there's a robust debate in military circles that it was wrong of Vajpayee to have restrained the army from crossing the LOC. Equally, Parakram was not the right choice. But remember, 99, 2001 were early days of going nuclear. We were not clear on where the red lines were. There was a great deal of ambiguity. There was sense the Americans were sitting across the other border in Afghanistan. We were supporting that. So there was a sense of saying, watch, restrain, get your objectives by other means. But unconscionable not to have taken those actions in 2008, by which time the red lines had been settled, the doctrines were clear, we should have gone about it. But now, I think we have complete clarity and understanding of Pakistan's doctrine.
My name is
this hard action now is something that we need to be doing, and are doing even more firmly should there be a terrorist provocation in the future.
The Republic of Djibouti.
Really, my point is that I have a
subject
slightly different nuance to this. My point is, we have enunciated a new doctrine with regard to nuclear.
And of course,
my point is that there's an automatic limitation there.
Job creation
what is
the most
what exactly will trigger the next
for our
Indian counter move?
Government?
Meaning, will it be the killing of one person?
All over Africa.
That means two guys with 10 kilograms of RDX can create an Indo-Pakistan war.
The demographic
dividend. You know, figuring out exactly where the threshold is. It's not going to be easy, because why I'm saying this is
demographic which could rise numbers of problems.
The reason is that
we are all striving to make sure that we are really delivering.
The Pakistanis, because they were caught, the fingerprints were all over Mumbai. So after that, they very cleverly stopped attacking civilian targets. You know, there was, of course, the Pune
50% of the population
bakery attack and all that. But basically, they started avoiding large civilian targets in other parts of India.
Really extend.
And they their attacks were limited to Jammu and Kashmir, and many of them were limited to police and
the World Bank Group,
army personnel. The whole point about Pahalgam was the civilian part. That's what is created
really,
the horror
much close
of the whole
to
event.
Our concerns.
So there was the Pakistani did shift their
he has a
their style of operating, and it is the shift away from that which has created this, which has led to this crisis.
Which we feel
now my point is that where will the new lines be? What will be the new red lines in practical terms? Why I'm saying this is that in 2016
should we do together?
We carried out the surgical strikes
partnership with
in
World
September,
Bank.
if I'm not mistaken.
AIDA
now, the interesting thing is that in November,
countries like Djibouti,
there was an attack in Nagrota,
our dynamic region, in a very sensitive and
the 16 Corps, and there was an attack there. 9 soldiers were killed.
So
I have actually a list of 3 or 4 more attacks.
This spring meeting.
We did nothing.
2025.
So the whole
Minister
point of the
Diwali
doctrine
was
of the terror is that you must act every
Djibouti
time.
and other
Now the
African
point is that
countries
every time
are ready
scenario
to capitalize
is
on
rather
their geographic
overwhelming, because in the sense
demographic
which means that it gives an individual terrorist
Africa
the right to stoke off an Indo-Pakistan crisis, Indo-Pakistan war. And what is also likely happening in Pakistan right now. Right now, the state and terrorists are linked. The state runs the terrorists, the Pakistani terrorists, meaning the Pakistan army runs the whole operation. But I envisage a situation where the Pakistani army is going to lose control. Already they lost control of our countries and Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and some other characters. If the Pakistani army loses control of the terrorists there, and this is the reason why the Pakistan army was present at the funeral in
it's not because partners are looking from us to make those changes.
So they were present openly
for countries like Djibouti.
Because they are, I think they are right now shivering in their boots that they are at the point where they could
finally
lose control
for a
of their
different perspective.
But the problem is it will create doctrinal problems for us.
Activities,
if the terrorists are detached from the state, right now we can take on the state and we can discuss the state, take on diplomacy, military action, etc. But if those terrorists get detached, that's going to be a terrible scenario.
Hi, my name is Omar Ben-Yeda. I'm the group publisher at Media Communications Group, ICE Publications, publishers amongst other platforms of African Business Magazine.
We should be very clear. There are no non-state actors in a country like Pakistan. They're all state actors, albeit operating under different labels, but they all operate.
I know. Report earlier this year ahead of
that
Davos,
is a Pakistani problem.
And it was a fascinating read and really a toolkit across all sectors what needed to be done and
if they can't control it, then I'm going and hitting was. And then the Pakistan army should not.
Thank you so much, and we are also very grateful
which is exactly
that
the message
you moderated one of the sessions.
They should support us,
right?
We can make it a joint effort. You know, they keep talking about joint inquiries. We can have joint operations.
So,
but let me just open this.
What are your key
point you raised? I think
takeaways
it's a very valid point. Those limits will have to be. I think the Pakistanis will also.
We're here at the spring meetings. We're only halfway through, so there's still a fair way to go. But when you speak to people about the spring meetings,
but let me throw this open to
the key takeaways so far, they'll say a couple of adjectives. One is uncertainty, and the fact that it seems to be a quieter spring meeting. From my perspective, one of my takeaways is that
so the floor is open.
We heard from the IMF in terms of African forecasts that given global headwinds, they've reduced the forecast from I think 4.2 to 3.9 average growth. But I look at Africa very differently. I'm seeing some the big economies re-emerging or reclaiming their place in terms of the drivers of growth. So the Nigerians, I think the reforms are starting to pay off. We're seeing in South Africa, following the government of national unity, we saw some progress, even though regards the budget, there's a bit of a sticking point there. But we're seeing the big economies playing a greater role, and that's what the continent needs. We need the Moroccos, the Egypts, the South Africans, and the Nigerians, and to some extent the Angolans and the Kenyans to be playing their part. So actually, I'm pretty optimistic in terms of the future after a tough 5 or 6 years. The other thing from a takeaway perspective is actually the lack of discussions around climate. Climate used to dominate discussions for a number of years, and today I think there's only 2 official World Bank events that talk about climate, and we've seen that it's taking
and why? That's the first question. And the second question was to you, Soumya. I don't think ISPR really is as good as you make it out to be. If it was so good, then why do you have a question of consolidation
like the rest of our guests?
I don't think then your argument doesn't make sense at all.
Optimistic
about the PTI trollsters are all trained by Ghafoor and his men.
I think there's been progress.
And they are better than the pupils are better than the masters.
And previous annual meetings.
And the ISPR has not been able to match
So what do I mean by that? I think we come
so I don't think the
with
ISPR is as effective as you make that to be.
Let's say weathered the storm, and even though the fiscal space is very
that's why they had to do a
we seem to be managing the situation a little bit better,
so that they could get
we're better prepared. Obviously, we've gone through 3 months of turbulence, global turbulence. But I think again, in terms of Africa's position, it's probably strengthened our resolve. It's also accelerated some of our decision making in terms of the need to strengthen our own institutions and to strengthen our own delivery mechanisms. And at the same time, we've always thought that the system has been rigged against us.
Whom are you asking this question?
So when everything's on the table, that actually enables you to put forward your position whilst everyone is renegotiating theirs. So from that perspective, and it hasn't necessarily been a bad thing, and it allows you to be bolder. If people are renegotiating their own trade terms, it allows you to also be more demanding in terms of your own needs and your own requests in terms of what you want from
because we are already
future
out
deals
of time now,
and,
so I'm extending
and from future transactions, including the processing of minerals and playing a greater role in global value chains. So I think we leave the spring meetings maybe with greater clarity in terms of what the future has in store, and also the need, as I said, to strengthen our own institutions in terms of our own development finance institutions. And it comes at a critical time, obviously, with new elections of the President of the African Development Bank and the African Export-Import Bank. So what we'll see is a greater, or at least a greater emphasis on domestic resource mobilization on the continent to be able to have strong institutions that can drive development and therefore less need to rely on external partners.
General Saab, please.
I have greatly enjoyed the fabulous insights from these distinguished leaders during this special episode from
we were supposed to break off at 5.
I am extending meetings.
Their comment has not been
Despite
made, so
the uncertainty surrounding the global economy,
pull it too much, sir.
most leaders remain optimistic about the prospects of African economy
don't have that much time.
as long as the right policies are successfully implemented. These policies must create jobs, develop the private sector, mobilize domestic resources, advance regional integration, and increase investment in key enablers such as energy infrastructure and digital finance to ultimately build economic resilience, inclusive growth, and alleviate poverty.
We said that
you can find the transcripts and full audio of all my conversations
then there will be
at
an appropriate response. So the escalation was built in.
Foresight Spring Meetings
is for Ambassador
I am Longlisime, and this has been Foresight Africa.
This is regarding
internationalization. For joining me today.
Firstly, can you define
the Foresight Africa podcast is brought to you by the Brookings Podcast Network.
There is a conflict between India and Pakistan, and there is a crisis.
At brookings.edu. My special thanks to the production team,
Number 2,
including Fred Durus, producer,
on bilateralism, because this is what India insists on, bilateralism.
And Nicole Tungire,
when the Pakistan National Security Committee responded on 25th of April
and Easy
to our
Taylor,
CCS response
Senior Communications Coordinator in Brookings Global.
Punitive steps that
the show's art was designed by Shabanti Mendis. Additional promotional support for this podcast
all
comes from my colleagues in Brookings Global
agreement in a
Office of Communications at Brookings.
Pakistan stops fomenting terrorism inside Pakistan. So I don't think we should be holier than thou in this matter on Balochistan. Thank you.
Hello
My name is Harsh Thakur. I'm from Hindu College, first year. I have two questions, I'm keeping them very crisp. The first question is, this open source piece.
Why are you asking the question?
Entire panel, anyone can respond.
किसी एक से पूछ लो ना,
don't Manoj sir.
Where I
say that correct.
Just ask
whoever. Sir, there were two things which were coming out. One was these open source chaps who were going around with this boron theory that Egypt had sent boron theory. Yeah, they were saying that Egypt had
innovative solutions. Boron theory. I thought you were talking about Pakistan policy.
Development challenges. So while highlighting,
so they were saying that boron has been sent from Egypt to handle this radioactive leak. So I want your comment on that. And secondly, what is up with these earthquakes which have been happening at a frequent kind of frequency in Pakistan very lately?
You can learn more about this show
the ambassador
and our work
Shukla. What will be the India's approach if China enters into the war? Yes, something will happen in future. Will it be only at the diplomatic level, or it will escalate to the military level?
At the World Bank, responsible for development policy
could
and
India create a doctrine akin to
in
India
his role,
doctrine, which
Dr.
was Israel's
Axel
deterrence
oversees
policy,
the
or maybe
bank's
a modified version of
partnerships,
it in India,
including with the
which
United
matches
Nations,
India's
international financial
My name is
institutions,
Raja Munib. I have two
and
questions, one for
bilateral
Soumya and one
partners,
for General Shukla.
and co-chair
Soumya,
the
when are we going to
replenishment
see
of the
information
International
warfare
Development Association.
being incorporated in
Prior to this,
official doctrine?
Dr. Axel oversaw
we have
the
seen
bank's
from our
global
side,
operation
Pakistan uses it as a
with
strategic
a footprint spanning more than
value to it
140
and,
offices and was responsible
as information
for
warfare.
delivering the World Bank's lending
is it
and
more that the
financial
Pakistanis basically wanted
support,
to come down the
averaging about $70 billion US dollars per year. This podcast episode was recorded at the World Bank headquarters during the 2025 spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund
because
and
despite the ceasefire, we saw violations happening. So is it that the Pakistanis
leaders
wanted us to walk down the ramp and
to
come down to a level of
solve
LOC and IB immediate
most
and keep that
complex
conflict
global economic
limited to that space only? And
This
have we agreed to that
on-site
kind
recording
of de-escalation model from
environment explains some of the background
Captain Robert van Bruyness, Netherlands Embassy. I've got a question for General Shukla.
Dr. Axel.
How do we know, we talked about red lines for nuclear escalation. How does India know
one of the most extraordinary and impactful careers
how can we stop
at the World Bank?
Nuclear escalation?
What initially drew you to international relations, economics, and how has your work evolved to shape global financial systems and advance development outcomes
during
over
that
time?
Exchange in that early
well,
morning,
I've always been motivated about
development,
economics, development in itself. And the World Bank was for me always the premier organization, which after now 37 years, I believe it is true. And
my next question
the other motivator is you need to be passionate about this.
India and Pakistan. I mean, we have seen that even though India is
as an international community can affect change, we can actually make a difference with developing
and also
countries.
Chinese stock downs.
Over time, I would say what has always kept me going is that you need to keep the sharp focus on the countries themselves. Learn from them, listen what is happening, so what are their challenges, and how the international community can complement their efforts to improve the lives of people in this country. And I have seen that with the World Bank, you can make an enormous difference if you keep the initiative, listen so that you understand their problems, and then drive change. Involvement from US.
Insightful.
The
2025 IMF World Bank Spring meetings have chosen job creation as the central theme. With the many complexities facing the global economy today, why was this theme selected And how can the World Bank support countries, including those in Africa, in creating jobs and addressing employment challenges?
So, the problem can be best summarized when considering that over the next 10-15 years, about 1.2 billion young people in emerging markets will enter the workforce. Yet, it is expected that maybe only a third of them will find regular jobs. That leaves an enormous gap that is unacceptable and is an economic loss because they are the future, they can make the changes, and particularly Africa is often affected of this challenge. So I think to really make it much more visible that this job problem affects so many people, young people, should be a cause for concern, but also a need to consider the options.
No, we don't. We have about. So
this
I
was
want to finish as early. I'm already 10 minutes over. Okay, but answer all the questions. I'm going to take them all the questions addressed to me quickly.
They range from the regulatory, how governments can improve its policies to incentivize job creation,
India deal with terror?
Concrete
I think what India has demonstrated to the world, to itself,
complementary
is that it has the
and necessary.
to deal with security challenges
education agenda
and not let them interrupt the India growth story, because that is the central story,
as well
dealing
as
with China, dealing with Pakistan
how
in
we can
a
mobilize much more
way
also the private sector, because after
contain
all,
these
most jobs
quickly
are created
and yet
by the
effectively
private
set up
sector.
a deterrence.
And so this
on
is
the question of
something
terror
that
and
needs to be
promoted, data available to terrorists. I think this will always
in
be
terms of
an issue.
Awareness building,
this wasn't
but
really
also
a high-tech operation.
Channel
in
this
Pahalgam.
into
you
the
having a
willingness
few
to
people
act.
with machine guns.
And here clearly the
fighting,
World Bank has emphasized we are ready,
was
ready to
not
act,
a very hard
and
thing.
we are ready to act.
What we have to do is maximize
governments,
this
but also
counter-infiltration and the counter-terrorism grids and work in multiple domains to strengthen intelligence and security, and that I'm sure
has
will
left
be the lesson
many
learned.
across Africa
On
concerned
the question
about
of
the
internationalization of Kashmir, how do you define it? How does Pakistan? How does India define it, or what is it?
Nations
well, what internationalization looks like is what we had
economic
in the 40s and 50s. And what Pakistan wants is this matter to go to the UN.
Landscape.
And
well, we have seen this in a broader context.
So
Africa
I think none of that
is in general affected
is only Pakistan's
by
fantasy.
That trends that can be economic development, it can be financial development, it can be trade development, but you have also seen what COVID can do. So there are multiple challenges that affect the continent, so you need to take a broad-based approach, how one can reduce vulnerabilities in the African economies, and we have been working on this. That is making these economies far more resilient against shocks, and that involves
to take action against terrorism, and we'll do that each time.
To trade policy,
on the question
financial
of
policies, but also
China,
what
again,
can you do in
that
terms
would
of
require another whole
infrastructure?
session.
What can
but
you do
in a sentence,
terms of human
China this time was not involved. You're right.
In all these areas, we're not only working in an advisory role, but also in an important financial role. And particularly with these challenges,
even in terms of
African countries have been challenged to attract enough
UN,
capital.
it was minimum.
Certainly here at the World Bank we have been hypersensitive for this and have been assuring that the disbursements that we are providing to African countries are positive, meaning the disbursement exceeding the
I don't think it's right
repayments,
to interpret
and
the
that
ceasefire
is
as something
certainly something in difficult time, a
in
challenge
each step
that
of
we
the
pose to
escalation
all
ladder.
creditors
made to
to ensure that Africa can
on the 7th of May,
receive
India told
positive net
our
flows.
DGMO told Pakistan,
Not enough
we've
with
done,
that.
we've struck
We also think it should be in a concessional form, meaning below market rates,
but if you
so
do
that
nothing,
actually
we might be done
they are not each
stage, if you see the statements coming out, the official statements, they were saying the action is over and
for
the
example, in the World
de-escalation
Bank case,
is on the table. So what
financing.
happens on the 10th of May was clearly the Pakistan side suing for peace after
financing,
being really
long-term
hammered
dialogue,
in
and
the
that
attacks
is the
on the
reason
11th
why
on
the
the 10th
bank
of May
is
in
in all
11
present
bases
in
and so
all
on.
African countries to work
the
closely
external
with
diplomacy
the government,
was
with the
really
private
supporting
sector, with the civil
Indian
society
use of force,
to make change
which got Pakistan
happen
on the table.
and make
On Balochistan, what should we do? Balochistan is already on the boil.
And job opportunities.
It's sensing the weakness of the Pakistan army.
With the
And Turkey and
2030 Sustainable
Azerbaijan,
Development Goals
again,
fast
there are
approaching
multiple
and
diplomatic
the
and other
development
levers
financing
for them
gap
to
widening.
escalate the cost
How
for
is
these
the
countries
World Bank responding, and
to
what
supply these
short,
weapons
medium,
to
or long-term
Pakistan, and I'm
strategies
sure those will
are
be used.
advancing to help countries manage these deficits and stay on track toward achieving their development
issue
goals?
of boron, I think that's just
essentially two words: stay engaged.
One of the features of
the World Bank has not been withdrawing
the level of misinformation and
its
disinformation
commitment to be proactive,
trying to figure out what is the
countries
what is
face
true,
the many challenges they have and
there's
provide
a
the necessary
report that 4 Indian
financing.
aircraft were shot
Our
down on day one.
criticism is that many
To my mind, that's true.
are withdrawing from
determine
Africa or from low-income
true or not,
countries,
to
and
a whole day.
that is a problem
Meaning
because
from contacts
Africa
to
needs to
pictures
attract
to
the necessary
whether this picture is
capital.
accurate
We
or
have
not
never
accurate,
done that. We have
So
stayed involved
this
in
is
it.
a
In
feature
fact,
of
we
the
have
new situation.
increased our
Now you have
exposure
Pakistani,
and also the
people
importance of
putting on the
Africa
internet
within our
a thing where it shows
portfolio.
that
Think of this.
two bombs
in
on the runway
2000,
of
only 15% of our total commitments,
but if you
was
look
at that time of barely
third-party, for example, if you look at
$3 billion
pictures, there's nothing
went
there.
to Africa.
So
Today
what I'm
you
saying
are
is
talking
that
about
we have to do,
45% of our total
teach a
commitments
class
going
to
to Africa,
Asian College of
and we're
Journalism
talking
on this,
amounts in
on
the
defense
order
and security.
of, depending on the year, between 30 and
Basically, your job,
$35
meaning
billion.
journalist's job,
That is why we believe in Africa, we believe in the cooperation, and we believe that we have to provide the right package of support. That means we need to provide advisory service, good studies that can actually help in the design of new projects, but also how one can embrace future policies, as well as with a financing package that is affecting people, be it in the country, but also has a wider effect on Africa's development, for example, in the trade area.
The nature of the aircraft, this is where it was
you are a key leader and architect
so you have a lot of OSINT going.
But
the problem with
OSINT initiative,
and I think Mr. Sinha will
the largest
tell you,
and the most comprehensive debt relief program for poor countries, and
really
you have remained engaged with the initiative throughout your career.
Actionable
20 African countries
which only
are
the professionals
in or
can
at
really
risk of debt distress. What steps is the World Bank taking to assist countries in addressing this debt burden, and how does the newly passed replenishment of the International Development Association
they are so ingrained into this whole
achieve
offensive operations
these goals?
And where we lacked, we have
so
seen
indeed,
that
I have directed the HIPIC initiative that was running from the mid-1990s, and in most countries got relief and effective relief through the first years of the 2000s. Although lately, in a couple of years, also countries like Somalia, as well Sudan, got debt relief packages.
This brings me to the question of when will we have a doctrine? I would say rather than having just a doctrine, we should have it in action.
There has been a renewed
this is already a part of our theaterization discussion and discussion on modernizing the armed forces. That we
there
need
is,
to have
of course, a
information
complete
warfare
change
agency,
of the creditor landscape.
And is,
while previously
both
official
offensive and
creditors
defensive in
from
nature.
the
So rather
Paris
than
Club,
having it lost in somewhere in words of
from
doctrine,
OECD countries
I rather
dominated the credit landscape now with our non-Paris Club creditors. They range from China, India to the Gulf states. And then there are also a lot of debt is owed to Eurobond holders and commercial creditors. This is complicating debt restructuring processes, and that is something that needs to be resolved. The G20 created a common framework to help implement restructuring processes, as well as we created with the IMF and the G20 presidency the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable to promote debate on how we can actually best help these countries. Now, those things need to pursue. We believe we should also be faster in this, and so that countries can benefit quicker the debt relief that they deserve. What we also think is where countries and creditors can help themselves is that we need far greater transparency. The bank usually announces what kind of financing we provide, what are the terms, and that they are easily accessible so that there is total transparency. We would like that kind of experience also replicated by all creditors so that actually we know in real time what is happening with the debt situation of an individual country, not only the foreign debt but also the domestic debt, because domestic debt in many African countries have become very important. In many countries they are representing even the majority of the debt.
Pressure there on people. The whole
what the bank
of
itself
the
can
whole
do.
Infiltration would have
we did that after the HIPIC initiative. That we said if countries again face a difficult debt situation, we have an automatic mechanism where we provide ex-ante debt relief by softening the terms, and that includes grant terms. So if a country is in complete debt distress, we are providing a country then with grant terms in our financing. A good example is, for example, Zambia, that has faced a very difficult debt situation, where we then provided grant financing in order to relieve the country from all the pressures, be it from the budget side, but also economy-wide, and so that more money can be directed to necessary investments in infrastructure, physical as well as human.
We are in a similar mess.
The World Bank has increasingly relied on foresight tools like scenario planning to anticipate long-term development challenges and opportunities. How does this approach shape the bank's strategic decisions and improve the impact of its lending and assistance, particularly when it comes to poverty reductions in regions like Africa and in the face of global trends such as global health challenges, geopolitical competitions,
if you see all these emerging technologies, AI,
food and security,
all of them lie at the cusp of
disruption.
It's not a technology which is a
for the World Bank to be effective, you need to work in close partnership with everyone. You can no longer solve this alone. A single agency like the World Bank cannot do that. We can only do it together on the basis of the programs designed by the countries themselves, and then in cooperation with other partners. That can be other multilateral partners, it can be with bilateral, it can be private partners.
And in the next 8 years,
so therefore, we are working closely with UN agencies, particularly in fragile states, where we are working very closely, with, for example, with UNHCR or with UNICEF, to coordinate our support in fragile states, and where these agencies sometimes can help us implement much better our and their programs. Secondly, we are, of course, also working with the other multilateral development banks because that provides an opportunity to complement each other in the financing of these countries. So sometimes we coordinate it in such a way that we finance primary education and the other agency or other bank is doing secondary education. So it's a matter of coordination between these multilateral development banks. Similarly, it is important that when the IMF has programs, that we coordinate their macro framework with our investment strategy. And then finally, it's clearly with the bilateral donors, we have a close cooperation agreement, and then, very importantly, the private sector that works in the countries, but where we can also have good understandings on how we can best work together. It helps in this context that the World Bank Group has the advantage of having not only two public sector oriented organizations like IBRD and IDA, but we have also two private sector organizations, IFC, MIGA, where we can rely on that they also work closely with the private sector and see how we can complement our support, be it from the public, be it from the private sector, can have maximum effect.
We need no treaties.
I really like it how
we'll get caught off in Indus and all that thing with that. 90% of legacy chips, 70% of CNC equipment has been given by China to Russia. Russia would be nowhere in the Ukraine conflict without partnering. Similar China Park. They've got their entire inventory is China. Their ammunition supplies from their artillery, everything is Chinese. So actually you are already fighting a two-front war. So this is the whole problem. This thing has to be understood. Somebody said Israel.
Well, we partner that partly very operationally. That can be certainly with the IMF, with whom we have partners for many, many decades. Here we coordinate particularly also program design, financing. For example, the HIPC initiative, we would have joint documents to provide not only the debt sustainability analysis, but then also the program that had to be supported. Today, we do, for example, debt sustainability analysis together with the IMF in the low-income countries. We do that also with multilateral development banks, where we have a very close and operational relationship. With others, we also work on, for example, on knowledge, where we do that together and then define how we can leverage other expertise to maximum effect. So there are different forms of this. Clearly, what is most important is of course, the continuing dialogue with the government we try to help, is namely how we can provide relevant analysis, relevant policy options for them, and how we can respond quickly to questions they may have, and how we can bring a comparative view to the table, meaning we work globally, so we could actually, on the basis of our experience, of our operational experience, tell also government what worked and what was more challenges. So there are these different types, and we have always to be open to adjust as new situations arise, because the organizing principle is effectiveness and relevance and time.
I'm an army man, but I'm saying
fabulous. I always like to end each interview by asking the guest two questions.
Based response, strike code. It's not working.
First, building on your work and experience, what is one piece of advice you would give to African or global policymakers to ensure
in my view, it's not
the best outcomes
I would rather invest in a drone missile force.
Let
me say our AD has done well against Pakistan. The Chinese have the most sophisticated instrument of long-range hoping to follow our AD is nowhere. Look what the Israeli AD is. So
well, it's very simple. I think you need to stay ambitious. There are large challenges in this world that require that you stay bold.
China's J20s, in my view, I don't know what you think, Sushant, in 1 year will be with the
We can do it.
See how the equation will change. You'll be back in the game. The J20s. So it's all very complicated, you know. So these are things.
Commitment.
The last point I'd like to make, you know, we should start pushing for this argument also when we talk of nuclear and all these problems will get solved if the Pak military submits to civilian control.
Because without passion and without belief,
we have
a
professional military.
And I believe that people need to be far more motivated, that you have a can-do attitude, that you can transform a continent, that you can create a prosperous Africa for everyone.
I agree with everything you've said
within our reach,
except the last point. I don't think that's going to happen, so let's not even go down that road.
And I'm always saying that requires
and you know, this is the problem with all our strategies, that at the end of the day we start making, you know, these wishful thinking.
Successor,
so please give it up, be realistic, you stay in the realistic domain, that'll be better. But thank you everybody, thanks a lot, General Shukla, Manoj, Soumya, Ambassador Bisaria, and of course Nirupama is not here now.
Thank you so much for joining me
very much. I thought it was a fabulously, you know, you guys gave fabulous comments.
I am London,
and thanks a lot, and thanks everybody to the audience for your patience and forbearance for lasting for 2 hours. Thank you, and thanks a lot
today
to my colleagues at ORF, Komal,
brought to you by
Shivam, and of course Aditya, people who put together this whole thing. Thanks a lot.
Feedback and questions to podcasts@brookings.edu. My special thanks to the production team, including Fred Dose,
Hungary,
producer,
Poland, Romania, even Moldova. But I think it's also important for people in the region to realize how this is playing out in the rest of the world. That it is creating a huge fuel crisis, a food crisis, a fertilizer crisis, pushing inflation in low-income societies which don't have the margins really to absorb that. And so it can very quickly become political in many societies.
I think that brings up an interesting question that's come in from an online audience member, which is relevant to this, this point that you make about the rest of the world versus right here, right now in Europe or in the West. How interested are the Indian people in the war in Ukraine? Is it a major concern? Is it a minor concern? And you've kind of alluded to the fact that it's affecting fuel, it's affecting food, but how interested is the populace itself?
I think it's a major concern. It's a major concern for two reasons. Look, today our existence is very connected. I mean, everybody sees things on the television, on their phones, on the net,
a new podcast
so wherever you are. And because
every 2 weeks,
bear in mind today India is a very digital society. Even people at lower levels of income, the one thing they do have is the connectivity. So there is a lot of awareness. I don't think anybody everybody is,
economic and workforce
to put it mildly, disturbed.
And the built environment, changing demographics,
the conflict,
place-based policy making, the future of work in the age of artificial intelligence, and much more.
But the other part of it is, it is begun to impact
the Los Angeles fires are one of the most destructive disasters in U.S. history.
It's impacting the
as the immediate emergency response turns toward longer-term recovery and rebuilding, several challenges remain, including the region's overwhelmed and vulnerable water.
It will have, impact for farmers to get along with sowing.
The hydrants, pipes, and other systems we depend on for safety and survival remain underinvested and ill-equipped
it is impacting business in multiple ways. I mean, there's a container problem, there's an insurance problem. You don't get certain commodities, or if you do, the prices are up.
Director of UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation, discuss how the fires expose long-standing challenges within water utility systems
I mean, at the same time, I think some of the lockdowns in China are also having an economic impact. But when you disrupt the economy, it shows up in employment.
You can learn more about this
so I think it does trouble people. Trouble people is a very,
well, it's a job of a government. I understand it would trouble people. I think it troubles people in the West as well when cost of